Across the centuries, the search for truth has never ceased, and one mind still stands as a guiding light. Welcome to the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Theology and Philosophy Department at Divine Word College Seminary. In addition to teaching seminarians and religious at Divine Word, I also teach those in formation for the Permanent Diaconate Program in the Archdiocese of Dubuque, offering courses like the Philosophy of God, Christology, Metaphysics, Epistemology, and Trinitarian Theology. Here, we walk in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas, exploring the mysteries of existence, the nature of God, and the pursuit of wisdom that shapes the soul. That journey begins now. Welcome to episode 2 of the Thomistic Mind, where we're looking at whether one should study philosophy. Now, if you recall from last time, the central question was, should the Christian engage in the study of philosophy? Right? Philosophy, many say, is abstract, purely academic. Many times it's simply, it might be interesting, right? You might have a nice philosophical conversation, but far removed from the life of faith. And this, what we talked about last time is, if what we said last time is true, that couldn't be farther from the truth. As a matter of fact, the life of faith very much has philosophy as an essential part of it. And so, if not done rightly, then the worry about it being potentially dangerous, which is something we're going to talk about today, right? That is not studying philosophy, not studying logic and those sorts of things, then you are vulnerable, right? You are vulnerable to bad ideas. And so far from being a threat to devotion and orthodoxy, the witness of sacred scripture from last week, we saw that God invites us to reason together. Isaiah 1:18. Not blind faith, but not suppressing our thought, not brainwashing, but dialogue, reasoning, engaging our intellects as well as our hearts, right? Reasoning with God is not an enemy to our relationship with God, right? As a matter of fact, our life, our faith life requires us reasoning, right? You can think of almost prayer and worship as a way of reasoning. We saw that in the greatest commandment, Jesus talks about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. So one's life, faith life, right, living the faith, requires loving God with your mind. Not just an emotional act, although it's not less than that. It is a spiritual thing, but it's also an intellectual part. Thinking deeply, truly about God can be an act of worship. Of course, philosophy helps us to do what? To do precisely that. To exercise, to enlarge, and to shape, to form, to train our intellects, to order them. And so engaging in philosophy can be a way of loving God with our minds. Okay? What, you want to love God more? The mind is necessary. Well, if the mind is necessary, philosophy is a tremendous help when it comes to loving the one true God. Also, avoiding immaturity in the faith, growing up in the faith. That was 1 Corinthians 3:11, right? We use our minds to grow up. We're not childish. When you're a child, you're childish, right? Infantile, narcissistic, lacking self-discipline, immature, silly. That's fine if you're a child, but we need to put childish things away. We need to outgrow them, right? Keeping what? Keeping the childlike aspect. Right? Having childlike trust, childlike innocence, childlike wonder. So I think about Christ's verse, right? Be as sharp as a serpent, but as innocent as a dove, right? That two aspects, right? Not childish, sharp minds, right? Trained minds. Having a formidable mind, like a serpent. Serpents aren't easy to deal with. Serpents are very tough to tangle with. That's the kind of mind that you want. The Lord says, have that kind of mind, be that kind of shrewd, yet have a sort of childlike innocence, childlike trust, a childlike wonder. That needs to be nurtured. that needs to be promoted. So in a way, not having wonder, people often think, I'll just quote here, comment here, a lot of people think becoming an adult is to lose that trust, is to lose that wonder. Heaven forbid, perish that thought. No, innocence and wonder is part of being a mature thinker, keeping that childlike wonder. And speaking personally, philosophy helps you stay like that. Philosophy helps keep you in a state of utter amazement. Right? Philosophy keeps you from just falling asleep mentally and just going through the motions. Opens you up to the mysteries of being, reality. One of the things that I love about philosophy is it really helped me to see just how incredible that there's anything. Like, I can't believe not just that I exist or that that the world around me exists. I can't believe anything exists. And philosophy helps you ponder that, the mystery of existence. So again, philosophy is tied to being childlike. Philosophy is tied to having that childlike trust that Jesus talks about, right, in Mark 10, that having that childlike trust, without it, you can't enter heaven. You can't enter the kingdom of God. And we looked at how the Bible commands us to give reasons, not just to give reasons, but to be prepared. We have to be prepared. Are you prepared? Am I prepared? Are we taking time to get trained? And so you can see that part of the life of faith requires a disciplined, philosophical life, or in some way. There's got to be some way in which you are preparing yourself. It requires study. And this is why we have universities, because all the way back, if you're a Catholic Christian, you're listening to this, part of your pedigree, part of your patrimony, right, part of your gift, right, part of your family is the church through the monastic tradition and through these monasteries provided centers of learning, centers of philosophical and theological learning. Origin, clear back to the beginning, had centers of learning. This is your heritage. It's part of the job. Part of being a Christian Catholic is being prepared, which means what? You need to study. You should, and we could have some episodes on how you develop a library. You need to have some books. We can talk about whether they could be Kindle version, but you probably can tell my views on that. I like the more earthy, human, right? The paper, the cover, the smell. There's nothing I like better other than my wife's perfume. My wife always smells great. Sorry. Is go into an old bookstore and smell the books. It's a wonderful smell. So, be prepared to do what? To give an apologia, to give a reasoned defense, to be God's lawyer, right? To stand up, to stand in the gap. Be prepared to give an answer. Again, and philosophy trains us in precisely that discipline. Philosophy trains us to do what? To be prepared. Helps you, train you, how do you construct an argument? How do you construct a sound argument? How do you handle an objection? How do you point out error? How do you engage someone who has a different argument? How do you expose a fallacy? How do you discern truth from error? Right? Again, this is Jason Reed, Dr. Jason Reed. This is the Thomistic Mind, where we're discussing how does one and whether one should study philosophy. And right now we're in the middle of looking at some verses from last time that we looked at and reviewed for why we should give reasons. Right? People might think you got to have it, I reason, I witness, I give my testimony, I share what God's done for me, and that's a great thing to share what God has done for you. And I'm not trying to take that away from anybody. However, when it comes to giving one's testimonial, there is a limitation you have to recognize. The limitation of testimonies, the limitation of giving your story of how God, led you or how He gave meaning, is that every faith tradition, every religion has testimonials. Every religion has testimonies of people changing their lives. That would not make your witnessing anything special. That is, you wouldn't give someone a reason for your hope because the reason for the hope is that you're trying to share that hope. You're trying to communicate that hope to another. That's what arguments and reasoning does. It allows one to communicate ideas to another person so that they can see it for themselves. Part of training people in philosophy is that you're training them to teach themselves. You're teaching them to be their own teacher. Having that ha-ha moment. Yeah, I see it. I got it. I see what you're saying. I'm following. Right? A standard, whether I like it or not, a standard syllogism I have given for years, and I give this in my testimonial, is the following argument. Jesus is God. And because Jesus is God, whatever Jesus teaches is true. Jesus teaches that unless I eat his flesh and drink his blood, I do not have life within me. Therefore, it is true that unless I eat his flesh and drink his blood, I don't have life within me. Other people can see that. They say, I see what you're saying. I can see why you believe that. And now let me see why I disagree with you. See, now what have we done, right? When you're prepared and you can give a reason, then you can have this sort of dialogue that has gentleness and respect. Why? Because when you give a good reason, it respects the person that you're sharing with. You respect them, that they can follow it and they can think it for themselves, and you expect maybe possibly they would have a response to you. Philosophy helps with all of that. Moreover, people are leaving the faith. 9 out of 10, according to some current data. Go look at the previous episode. Michael Rodas, the person, Dr. Rodas, you want to look up. 9 out of 10 cradle Catholics are leaving the faith. Maybe if we gave arguments and made good apologias and we gave sound instruction, maybe we could convince people that it's true, then maybe something could change there. But there's just no training in logic hardly anywhere. That's one of the things we talked about last time, right? We are commanded in 2 Corinthians to destroy arguments and every proud obstacle to the knowledge of God. There are arguments whose conclusion is that there isn't a God. There are arguments whose conclusion is that God is, if there were a God, he'd be evil. And so then that's an obstacle, right? If someone is giving an argument whose conclusion is God doesn't exist, then that's an obstacle to what? Taking every captive and make it obedient to Christ. People cannot take their thoughts captive if the conclusion of the argument they believe is that there isn't a God, or that the Catholic Church is immoral, or that the Eucharist is made up by the church, or that the church is full of a bunch of superstition, or the church is anti-science. All these conclusions are from arguments. And what does the Paul say? We have to destroy that argument. Now that's strong language. Not destroy people, arguments. How do we do that? Well, philosophy is unique in that it studies how to do that. It studies the structure of an argument. It helps you distinguish between the valid and the invalid, the sound and the unsound, and the fallacious. And too often, unfortunately, we don't teach logic in high schools. We're not teaching it in colleges. We teach it in the seminary. It's mandatory. Why? Because you cannot be a teacher without knowing how an argument works. You cannot be a teacher without knowing how to put ideas together and draw conclusions. It's not a coincidence that so many people who want to go into law, guess what their bachelor's degree's in? It's in philosophy. Why? Because within philosophy, you have to have a class on logic. Any philosophy program, any philosophy curriculum that's worth anything has philosophy as a required core course. And so, as we talked about last time, are we really educating anybody if we're not teaching them how to understand the basis of reasoning? Moreover, we looked at how intellectual formation for church leadership requires logic, requires philosophy, because we are, in our bishops and our elders and our teachers, if we're going to give instruction and sound doctrine, you give sound instruction by arguments. I mean, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is one big argument. The Scripture, all the didactic literature in Paul in the Old Testament, right? That's all arguments. Drawing conclusions. How many times have you heard of therefore in the Scripture? Well, that's indicating what? That there is an argument. That indicates instruction. And so there's that intellectual dimension to instructing, right? Sound doctrine, refutation, contradiction, confute. That's all logical categories. Implies what? Logical precision and logical training. Again, if you just joined us, this is the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed. I am Dr. Jason Reed from Divine Word College Seminary, where we train seminarians and lay people and religious in philosophy. And so today we are we're expanding and reviewing a little bit of last week's Bible verses on whether or not we should study philosophy. And I hope I'm making the case that we should. And so if we're going to, again, go back to this Corinthians passage, if we're going to confute error, how many people today had the kind of instruction to refute skepticism, to refute atheism, to refute pantheism, to recognize and define heresies like Arianism, Nestorianism, Sabellianism, defending the hypostatic union, the Trinity, creation, the Eucharist, a theistic God, so on and so forth. And too often, unfortunately, right, we're not doing that. So then we, last time, then we ended with, hopefully you've been thinking about it since the last episode, is the reflection on the Catechism statements that the Church in her teaching uses philosophy to understand revelation. Again, I'll read these paragraphs again. 251 and 252 from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Quote, in order to articulate the dogma of the Trinity, the Church, who founded the Church? Christ founded the Church. So it means Christ is behind this. Had to develop her own terminology. Why? Because the heretics wouldn't stop. If you go into Thomas's De Potentia, his Summa Theologiae, Thomas says that the Church Fathers had to develop this terminology because the heretics wouldn't stop objecting. So we had to do this. We could develop our own terminology. How are we going to do this? With the help of philosophy. Terms that philosophers were using. Substance, person, hypostasis, relation. In doing this, the Church is not submitting the faith to human wisdom. Right? We're using it to help to signify the ineffable mystery. And so the Church uses substance, sometimes rendered essence or nature, to designate the unity which is the divine substance. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. And the term person or hypostasis to designate the persons, the Father, the Son, Holy Ghost. And of course, relation we use to distinguish the persons from each other. And so I left off with this quote from this thought from last time, that quote from those two paragraphs begs the question: if the Church uses these philosophical terms to understand her teaching, then to the extent that one is ignorant of those philosophical terms, ignorant of their origin, ignorant of how the Church used those to help and change and varied the meaning so they can express in mystery, if you're ignorant of those terms in those ways, then you're going to be ignorant of the Church's teaching, which means you're going to be ignorant of Christ's teaching. And so a part of the Church's task is to expound the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ. Then if one does not understand her philosophy, that is the philosophy his Church uses, then one's going to be extremely limited in their expounding. And that's kind of where we left it last time. Now I want to pick up from there, because whether you know it or not, or anyone knows it, whether I know it or not, everyone is a philosopher. Everyone has a philosophy when they think. I think this is the real rub of the matter. You can't avoid philosophy. Stop thinking, I guess. But I guess that would be a philosophy, right? Well, my philosophy is not to think. There's no one who's not a philosopher. And so either you're a good philosopher or a bad philosopher. And that's what I tell my students. They say, how do I become a good philosopher? How do I become a wise philosopher? I said, we'll start off a poor philosopher and get better, right? Be more wise today than you were yesterday. Be less of a poor philosopher today than you were yesterday. This is how it works. Everyone starts off as a poor philosopher. I remember when I just got hooked into philosophy, I was taking a class at a community college, and my testimonial on Keith Nestor's YouTube channel can go into more detail. But the bottom line is that I fell in love with philosophy. I loved the argument. I loved that I could have conversations. I loved that we could have actual dialogue. I loved that I was able to explain and share my ideas with people and why they were true. So I was really excited about philosophy. And I knew it was hard, but I didn't realize how hard it was until I went to the university and took my real university philosophy class. And Dr. Smith was the professor, and he said, welcome to 19th century continental philosophy. I'm your instructor, Dr. Smith. And then 50 minutes he talked, and then at the end he said, here's your reading assignment for next week. I'll see you next time. I didn't know what he said. I didn't know what he was talking about. So I was a pretty bad philosopher. I had no idea what he's talking about. I thought, what is going on here? And that's when I talked to the professor and he said, well, yeah, you're just not a very good philosopher right now. Like, well, thanks. And that's where everybody starts. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. As a matter of fact, part of becoming a good philosopher is recognizing that you're not a good one. Think of Socrates. What made Socrates wise is that he alone was acutely aware of his ignorance. He was the wisest, not wise. He was the wisest in all of Athens. And of course, if you read the Apologies, as I mentioned last time, you'll see why. He said, of all the people I talk to, I know I don't know. They don't know, but they think they do. That is to paraphrase, all the people that Socrates talked to, trying to find out, say, what wisdom and virtue and love and all these things were, he said, none of us know. The people I talk to, they don't know either. But the difference is, I know I don't know. They think they do. So becoming a philosopher, you have to be ironically wise, right? Because you are a philosopher. Recognizing you're not a good one is on the road to becoming a good one. That's the key. Too many people are too confident on things they're simply not qualified to be that's certain on. So everyone has a philosophy. Everyone's either good or bad philosophy. And of course that comes in degrees, right? Obviously. And we are continually making philosophical judgments. And very often, I would say probably most often, totally unaware of it. Do not realize it. And I talk to so many, like say Bible teachers who teach in schools, completely unaware of the philosophical assumptions in their Bible methodology. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're completely aware that when they expound their biblical hermeneutics, I have yet to see them actually expound that hermeneutics. What I hear is what people who say that's the way to do hermeneutics, and here's your conclusions. Okay, but if the hermeneutics is follow principles A, B, and C to draw conclusion D, have you ever done that? Again, I wasn't aware of that. I just kind of thought I was doing that. We don't even realize the philosophy that we're using. And the problem with not realizing it, that is realizing that we're using philosophy, is that oftentimes people do not have a Catholic cast of mind. We do not have a Catholic form of life and devotion. Why? Because how can you have a Catholic form of life, a Catholic form of devotion, if you don't have a Catholic form of mind? If the ideas that we think with, if the ideas that shape our mind are incommensurate with the Catholic faith, with the Catholic life and devotion, then how do you live as a Catholic. I believe one of the major contributing factors to folks leaving the church is that they are directed by philosophical assumptions about what is real. How do I know something, right? Their metaphysics and their epistemology are setting framework constraints, right? Framework conditions for determining what people consider. That is, the philosophical assumptions about what they think is real and how do we know anything render how we consider things like how do we live? How should we solve our problems? What sort of explanations are plausible? What appears to, initially, what is unreasonable? Initially, what is reasonable? Again, that's driving it. So many thinking, and you can ask yourself, right? What ideas are driving my conclusions? I mean, have I really thought about, does my life in my mind line up with my devotions? And maybe it does. But but we have an adult in the room. The church is telling us, then the church in the scriptures telling us that philosophy is part of understanding the Catholic faith. Now, that means that philosophy is a kind of wisdom. And it's a kind of wisdom that natural reason can discover. However, that natural reason discovers wisdom, realizes it's imperfect. And so what you begin to see is that philosophy then prepares you for a higher wisdom, which is theological wisdom. We need revelation to perfect what we know by reason. Now, so the extent in which, right, this is a standard axiom in Catholic theology, that grace does not destroy nature, grace perfects nature, which means grace can only work with what's there. So if your philosophy is incommensurate with Catholic theology, then the revelation's going to have a hard time working with, developing, and perfecting your mind, because you're working with the kind of categories and the kind of soil that theology can't grow anything in. And of course, once you do Catholic theology, you realize you really need a mystical encounter, which we can talk about that later. So just to end this first episode, the first section of today, right, on the Thomistic Mind, right, we've been talking about the Catholic cast of mind. Now we're diving into, right, that how everyone's a philosopher, and that the fact that whether you know it or not, you're a good one or you're a poor philosopher. And too often, as a philosopher, a professor of mine used to always say, too many people get their philosophy of life by osmosis, by simply absorbing philosophical categories, philosophical commitments, and doctrines from their culture. So, we will take a break now, halfway through. We've been talking about the philosophical mind. We're talking about whether or not how well of a philosopher you are. And up next, after this short break, we will begin to look at, right, some examples of how philosophy is driving people's thoughts. And then we're looking at Paul when he's engaging the philosopher. So stay tuned. The Church teaches that a solid education and grounding in philosophy is necessary to find the truth and avoid error, to understand the mysteries of divine revelation, to grasp the Church's doctrine, and to engage an unbelieving world. Philosophy is so valued by the Church that she requires it to form the intellectual life of her priests. Read Thomas is an online program created to make this intellectual formation more widely accessible. Developed and taught by Dr. Jason Reed, the courses combine academic rigor with a spirit of faith, presenting the great themes of classical and Thomistic philosophy in a way that is clear, structured, and faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Participants encounter fundamental questions of philosophy through topics such as the pursuit of wisdom, an introduction to philosophy, an overview of philosophy's origins, methods, and enduring questions. There's He Who Is, examining the classical view of God's attributes and their theological and spiritual implications. We also have the mystery of existence, the philosophy of creation, exploring the metaphysical principles underlying the doctrine of creation. Then we have the three-person God, the mystery of God's inner life, a philosophical study of the Trinity's inner relations. There's also St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy of the angels, where we consider the nature and role of spiritual beings in Thomistic thought, and further courses that engage the treasures of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Read Thomas seeks to cultivate not only knowledge, but also a deeper appreciation of the harmony between faith and reason, helping participants enter more fully into the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church's philosophical heritage. The website is www.readthomist.com. That's www.readthomist.com. Email is read.thomist@gmail.com. That's reed.thomist@gmail.com. At Read Thomas, we believe the life of the mind is for every Christian. Welcome to the second part of episode 2 on the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed. I am Dr. Jason Reed. I'm an associate professor at Divine Word College Seminary, where I teach seminarians, religious, and those preparing for the permanent diaconate in the Archdiocese of Dubuque. And so earlier, last segment, we finished off with how people have their own philosophy, whether they know it or not. That is, everyone is a philosopher. Everyone has a philosophy. Everyone makes philosophical judgments, whether they know it or not. And many times that philosophy is incompatible with their Catholic commitments and Catholic faith. And one of the things I've been looking at and thinking about is how often, I've watched several debates online, and so often when it comes to debate, that is, the debate has, the positions of the debate have already been decided before the debate happens. What do I mean by that? So the question is the debate question is resolve. Is belief in the resurrection reasonable? Already, right, the disputants or the debaters already have philosophical assumptions at work about what's reasonable and what's not. And so there is a debate between an atheist and a Catholic apologist, and that's the name of the debate. Is belief in the resurrection reasonable? And when the skeptic began to expound his answer, the very first premise in the skeptical's argument was, or the first question, how does one tell if something is reasonable? That's the question. The skeptic's answer was, after a few qualifiers about how not everyone agrees on what reasonableness and there's no absolute, etc., made the following claim. Quote, a claim is reasonable if the claim is consistent with what we know to be true and possible within reality, end quote. That comes from the skeptic Matt Dillahunty. Now, right there, is this going to be a search for the truth of whether or not it's reasonable? I submit no. Why? Because how many resurrections are there? How many resurrections have existed? Now, the resurrection is not the same thing as a resuscitation. Okay, resurrection does not, just because someone was raised from the dead doesn't mean that they're resurrected. So I think part of the problem is the question, right? Only Jesus Christ resurrected, right? To resurrect is to what was mortal, right? When you resurrect, you are now raised immortal, right? Lazarus, who was raised from the dead, was not resurrected. Why? Lazarus passed away, right? Perished later, right? When people were raised from the dead in the New Testament, they still tasted death later in their life. Only Jesus is the resurrection. Only Jesus raised from the dead, immortal. So that's the first question. There's only a case of one. And so when you say, right, a claim is reasonable, if we know to be true with what's possible within reality, it's going to be very difficult to think, yeah, sure, it's possible when there's only one. So right there, the question is not a great question. And the principle of reasonableness, in a sense, I kind of side with, in a way, the skeptic. I mean, there's only an instance of one. So is it reasonable? By and large, no. Okay, that'd be the first thing, right? And so the debate, here's what I'm driving at. These debates, so much of it is not really over evidence. It's not a matter of laying out evidence. The debate is philosophical, meaning philosophy is what drives what evidence and what reasons are plausible, what sorts of explanations are reasonable. And so if you're a skeptic, then you think, okay, well, if there's, I mean, you're trying to tell me that there's only, it happened once. Resurrection happened once. That's kind of hard to believe. Why? Because ask yourself, if someone weren't a Catholic, someone came to you and said, hey, there's someone rose from the dead or was resurrected, would you believe it? I just think it's a bad question. Right? Why? Because philosophically, that's pretty hard to prove. You can't prove a resurrection. How do you know that someone was raised immortally? A better question is belief, is it reasonable to believe that such and such was raised from the dead? Now, that's a good question. Why? Because if you can show that the first verse of the Bible, right? So when it comes to the let's say, the rising from the dead, that if you believe in God, that's why I think all these debates about rising from the dead, debates about the Bible, debates about the Eucharist, is really a debate over the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created. So many philosophies are incompatible with that verse. Either skeptics don't think you can know it, doubt it, agnostics deny that we can know it, pantheists deny creation. It's really a philosophical debate over does God exist and what is God like. So it's not over evidence, as many people believe. And if you go and watch these debates, you'll see how evidence is just not swaying one way or the other. Most debates are driven by, again, to quote my professor, osmosis, right? There's certain philosophical categories, commitments, and doctrines that are driving how one sees the question, and moreover, how does one view what sort of solutions and explanations are even viable initially. Okay, so we really have to debate philosophically with our culture. We really need to debate philosophically over does God exist, is there a creator God, so on and so forth. Okay. Next verse. I want to look at a model. So we've been talking about verses and the commandments and all the things that are contained in these verses. What about a model? Right? Socrates has been kind of a model. Paul is a model. And the verses I have in mind for Christian engagement comes from Acts 17, 16 through 21. Now, there are some theologians who believe that Paul made a mistake here, but I don't think Paul made a mistake, and that can be a debate for another time. So I'm saying that I think Paul is a model of how to engage here. In Acts 17, verses 16 through 21, Paul encounters and interacts with philosophers, Epicurean philosophers and Stoic philosophers at the Areopagus. And here are just some bullet points of those passages. One, Paul is distressed by all the idolatry. He reasoned in the synagogue, and that was and in the marketplace, both of the synagogue and the marketplace, and that was a daily practice. So we see him reasoning, giving arguments, making claims, right? Making a case. The philosophers that debate him called him a babbler, suspected him of teaching foreign gods. they bring him to the philosophers to explain these strange ideas. Ideas they had never heard before. And of course, Luke notes that these Athenians, these philosophers, spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. And what's interesting about Paul in Athens is that there are basically three responses you're going to get when you philosophize and defend your faith. People who are ready to accept now. There are those who want to come back and I want to continue to talk with you. And there are those who simply will go on their way. So when you're philosophizing and you're defending the faith, you're giving arguments, right? So be prepared for those three responses, right? Because Paul is a model and he's an apostle, and those things happen. Now that culture that Paul was in, philosophers, because the Epicureans would be our secular humanists, right? Hedonistic, atheistic philosophers. And the Stoics would be our pantheists, right? Or the panentheists, right? There's not a personal God, right? Kind of like the God of Einstein, right? God is the God of the universe. God is a God of order, right? Or like a New Age view of God or a Hindu view of God. And so at Mars Hill, you've got the atheist, secular humanists on one side, and you've got the pantheist, New Age, Eastern ways of thinking on the other side. Where our culture very much mirrors Athens. Right, we live in a culture filled with competing views. Right, we have a marketplace, lots of views, especially now it's been heightened with the internet. Powerful media voices, constant marketing, constant debating, and just it's just overwhelming how much information. Moreover, talking about the YouTube world. Leading YouTube atheist and skeptic channels have millions and millions of subscribers. There are videos claiming to debunk arguments for God's existence, and some are like within 17 minutes, that literally have millions of views. And we'll be talking about this later, but to point this out, oftentimes these arguments, they contain distortions of arguments for God's existence. Sometimes they appear to be in bad faith. I mean, it's just so dismissive. I mean, if you're going to dismiss St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God based upon reason in a matter of seconds, when you just don't get it, right? And it's just not that simply refuted. And moreover, many of these YouTube atheists and skeptics, they're former Catholics. They're former Christians. And so you get kind of there's a bit of an edge sometimes. They can be a little sort of aggressive. Okay. Now just a sidebar here, when it comes to the YouTube world, whether Christian or non-Christian, I just want to impose here a certain principle. Now, before I do that, just to remind the viewers, if you've just turned in, this is the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed, and I am Dr. Jason Reed, the host of the show. And this is where we talk about the philosophical mind or the life of philosophy, whether Christians should study philosophy, whether philosophy should be a part of the life of faith. And this is the second episode where I'm trying to make the case that philosophy not only should be, that's a good idea, to be part of your faith life, but it's commanded, it's an imperative, and it's essential. Now, here's how philosophy can help you navigate, say, all the YouTube world. Because in philosophy, there is a principle of charity. What does that mean? Well, too often you watch these videos, and people are just putting up videos so fast. And the topics they're talking about, it takes a long time to study those things before you should say anything about them. Why? Well, because the principle of charity admonishes us that you must earn the right to critique. That is, the right to analyze, the right to reply, the right to critique has to be earned. And how do you earn that right to critique analysis? Well, before you do anything, you must learn the view you're thinking about. Before you criticize, you must learn and understand the view accurately. Now, this is where the Thomistic mind comes in. Maybe this is one of the first places in these episodes where there's an explicit appeal to the Thomistic mind. For the Thomist, following the angelic doctor, St. Thomas, we're going to try to understand and be charitable and try to put the ideas we're thinking about and maybe even make them stronger and better than the way they are presented to us. So let's say you're listening to a skeptic or an atheist or a non-Catholic, and they're giving you an objection, or they're giving you some sort of challenge to your beliefs. The principle of charity is going to say, can we make that challenge stronger? Can we make the objection even better than what the person's trying to say, right? Because you really want, that is, to get to the truth, you want to have a really clear and powerful and strong objection that you can. Why? Because that's how you think these things through. If you say someone's thinking about the Eucharist, you want to be a Thomist, you want the best objections and challenges that you can think of against the doctrine of the Eucharist. Why? Because that's going to help you see the truth for yourself and to make the doctrine of the Eucharist your belief. So before you criticize, you got to learn the view. It means you got to be accurate, no straw man. Sometimes they call it steam-manning an argument. But what's often missed is that not only do you must be accurate, you need to learn something from the view. And I think this is where a lot of the dismissiveness comes in. Especially, and again, I've been watching some skeptic and atheist YouTube channels, and when you don't learn something from a Catholic argument or a Catholic philosopher, then you really are you're talking past us. Like it's just a straw man, which means you haven't really learned something from it. Then you really can't analyze it. And you can see that in that tone. Why? Because there are very few philosophical views or system that there's nothing that can be said in favor of it. In another aspect of a Thomistic mind, I'm thinking about the great Thomist George Klubertans, Father Klubertans, longtime professor at St. Louis University many years ago. And in one of his books, and I've been looking for the quote, and I can't find it. That drives me crazy, because if I quote things and show you things, I want to bring the receipts. When I find it, I'll put it down on our YouTube channel. George Klubertans, I believe it's him, but I do know I've read this quote, that once one has studied and learned the philosophy of ideas, there's no longer the need to critique. Right? This idea of critique is a very modern concept. Thomistic thinkers don't critique. Thomistic thinkers move forward. Thomistic thinkers take truth and error and make it part of their way they see things. Right? So once you're accurate, and so you can learn something from a Kant. You can learn something from a Hume. Oftentimes, I will assign Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French existentialist atheist from the mid-20th century. Why? Because Sartre teaches us what it's like to lose God. Sartre is honest about, if there is no God, this is what you lose. Same thing with Camus. So yeah, you can learn that, but too many people can't be dismissive of Sartre. No, he's got something to say. Learn something from it. And then once you've been accurate and you've learned something from it, then you have, quote, earned the right to critique, even if critique is necessary. Oftentimes, you're just pointing out, here are just some inadequacies. And I think that's what Father Klubertans was getting at, right? So, for example, Hume's empirical epistemology is simply inaccurate to account for what human beings do in fact know. Kant's antinomies, right? They teach what happens when you treat time and space substantively, right? Then you're going to run into these contradictions, so on and so forth, right? That these things are informative. And that's why in the great Summa of St. Thomas, he always started with objections. And when we get into some of the Chesterton material a few episodes from now, Chesterton's going to talk about this, right? Talking about how Thomas would deal with these objections and how the objections and the problems and the challenges played a role in forming, right, his great philosophy. So again, what this little sidebar here, which is ending being more than just little, the idea is that if you start seeing someone just immediately going to critique, just jumping to critique, jumping to an answer, jumping to it, then they haven't really understood the idea that they're criticizing. Again, this happens, especially in my classes, all the time. And unfortunately, I think Catholics do this. Catholics are so quick to jump on an idea, to respond to the idea, that they need to listen to the idea. And philosophy will help you do that. Another pitch for why we should study philosophy. It help you become a better listener. Help you be a better dialogue partner, because you are engaged in the principle of charity. Right? Just to wrap this part up. Charity means what? Letting the other side, whoever your interlocutor, state their case, and oftentimes help make the case stronger. That is, make it worse for yourself. And I do this all the time in class. Someone will give me an argument from the atheist, and they'll ask me, Dr. Reed, what do you think about that? I said, oh, we can make that worse. we can paint ourselves in a tougher corner than this atheist can. Right? So that's part of it, right? Being charitable, trying to deal with the biggest challenge you can, because you really want to think about this. That's what the challenges do. And the stronger the challenge, the better the thinking. Then learn something from what you've just challenged yourself with, and then deal with inadequacies and strengths, quote unquote, criticize. Okay, so that's just the sidebar. And then, of course, if you see discussions on YouTube or whatever, and they're just immediately diving in critique and they're just dismissing everything, then watch something else. Okay, back to our culture. So we have a lot of popular atheists in our culture today, like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are still with us. Then you have the late Daniel Dennett and the late Christopher Hitchens. They were called the Four Horsemen of Atheism. They've helped shape public discourse. They've reached millions through their books, through their podcasts, and their videos, and just even their works, the titles, right? The God Delusion. God is not great. The End of Faith. Breaking the Spell. These works promote naturalism. They promote skepticism. And even some of Harris's work, they promote pantheistic themes. In particular, right, Harris is combining his atheistic naturalism with Eastern mysticism, right? And you watch his YouTube channel where he talks about, right, how the Buddhist tradition, the denial of this enduring self, right? And Christians are too latched onto this idea of self, so he's embracing some of the pantheistic and Buddhistic understandings of human nature. Fascinating stuff. So they've shaped the culture, okay? And you hear people say, well, no, there's an objection. But professor, they'll say to me, the impact of the atheism is waning, right? Isn't the atheistic movement dying? Right? Isn't the lantern of atheism all out of oil? And I think that's half true. My reply to that objection is that influences can wane, but that waning can be in different directions. And I will agree that that's true, that much of the hardline, aggressive atheism, like the delusion and God is not great and all that stuff, it's not as mainstream as it once was. However, its influence today is just as strong, and it's strong because so many have read those books and now they've moved on. So they're reading the God Delusion. Now, they didn't become an aggressive atheist like Dawkins, but Dawkins did help them move on from what? To move on from religion. So although these readers, their readers did not embrace the grace of atheism, they did embrace the secularism. They did embrace the atheism of these thinkers, And now they're living lives that never consider as ever initially reasonable something that's religious. And so the influence of the four horsemen, in a word, is that they've helped people move on from religion and faith. And that influence is with us. I mean, there's a sense in which a lot of these YouTubers have been spawned from these thinkers, right? Moreover, pantheistic and secular ideologies saturate our culture. We find the occult everywhere. It's found in our sexual ethics, self-help, humanitarianism. Now, I'll just pause there for a second. I'm not saying that the Catholic Church or it's bad philosophy to be humanitarian. That's a wonderful thing. Humanitarianism is great. Humanitarianism is not. Right? The ism takes that good word, humanitarian, and turns it into a school of thought, into a philosophy. Right? We believe in humans, Christians believe in humans, Catholics believe in humans, but that doesn't make us humanists. Right? There's one thing to believe in being practical, but that doesn't make us pragmatists. We can believe in science, but not believe in scientism. It's the humanitarianism, in a sense, is pantheistic. It's secular. Again, the recreational view of our sexual ethics comes out of the pantheistic and secular ideologies, and they saturate our culture, our entertainment, the way we see ourselves. It's everywhere. And so some final thoughts here for this this episode, second segment of episode 2. If we're going to follow Paul's example, if we're going to follow his example in the Areopagus, we too must be able to meet the challenges on their own ground. We need to be able to interact and debate secular, atheistic, like the Epicureans, and pantheistic, panentheistic, naturalistic, right, Stoics, right, our New Age and the occult and the secular. We need to engage them with clear thinking, careful reasoning, and confidence that the truth is in our side. That means we need to study philosophy, because the pressing question is, who among us is prepared, like Paul, to meet the ideas within the intellectual rigor and clarity they demand? So in closing, might sound kind of abrupt, but that's okay. We're coming to the end here. Should one study philosophy? Scripture, tradition, and reason itself answers with a resounding yes. Yes. Philosophy is not a rival to faith. It serves faith. It is the handmaid of faith. It trains the mind so that we can love God more deeply. We can defend the truth more effectively. And we can guide others more wisely, truly instructing them in the truth of the church. And so in these last 2 episodes, right, we've explored this. And in our next episode, episode 3, we're going to be looking at some ways that we should study. We're going to be looking at some church documents. We're going to be looking at some of what the popes have said. And then we're going to look at how St. Thomas is sort of a model, right? And how the church remains, how St. Thomas Aquinas remains the church's greatest guide in this task. So until then, please, may you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and yes, with all your mind. You've been listening to The Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, produced by Mr. Matt Graham. To learn more about our rigorous philosophy courses, visit us online at www.readthomis.com. www.reedthomist.com. It's been a privilege to journey with you through the world of philosophy, seeking truth, goodness, and beauty together. My hope is that today's conversation encourages you to think more deeply, live more wisely, and love more fully. Until next time, keep your mind fixed on the truth and your heart set on the highest good.